So Kamala Harris was sworn in as California's 32nd Attorney General in January of last year, and it was probably the first time that Kamala Harris, the only time that Kamala Harris was 32nd at anything in her life. She's a graduate of Howard University, Hastings School of the Law, former District Attorney of San Francisco. Here we go. Why she's a trailblazer. She's the first woman, the first African American, the first South Asian American Attorney General in our state's history. And we're going to spend the next little while figuring out how all this got wrapped up into one fascinating person. So Attorney General Kamala Harris, first of all, welcome to She Shares. We really appreciate you taking the time. And I just want to start with a little story. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing and profiling the Attorney General, who was then District Attorney of San Francisco. And I thought, I've been through some tough interviews. I've talked to people, I've talked to politicians, I've talked to people all over the world. And there is nothing like talking to a prosecutor and who has a way of just fixing you in her gaze and saying, yeah, try me. Try me. So it is a pleasure to be back together again in my post-journalist life, and it's really wonderful. I want to start with a mystery.
Okay.
Okay. And that is, and you can get to a lot of what you believe this way, but you were born in Berkeley, raised in the 60s and 70s, to parents who were civil rights activists, and you chose a career in law enforcement. And that is something I think that for a lot of people might be counterintuitive, but not for you, and I'm wondering why.
So, first of all, it's so great to be here, and I want to just thank everyone who has created this opportunity for us to be together in an intimate setting under one roof, because so much of what we all know is that we often will find ourselves in rooms where we don't see a lot of people that we think understand who we are or look like us. But let's take this moment to just look around and remember that, especially for you young women, whenever you are in that situation, you need to just remember this and remember you are never in that room alone. We're all in there with you. So thank you all for the honor of being a part of this. Karen Skelton, thank you for the work that you've done to create this opportunity in Dewey Square. So I grew up, the daughter of parents who met in the Civil Rights Movement. So that meant basically being surrounded by a bunch of adults who spent full time marching and shouting about this thing we call justice. And the point behind a lot of the passion there was that vulnerable people and voiceless people must be heard. And we must, all of us, do everything we can to give voice to their condition, to their circumstance, to their experience. And so when I made the decision in law school to become a prosecutor, a lot of folks, Karen, thought, well, this doesn't follow. It seems that someone who comes from a civil rights background, if they choose criminal law at all, they would become a public defender, or like my sister went on to head the ACLU.
ACLU, yeah.
But I decided that let's not accept false choices about what it means to be a voice for the voiceless. Because the reality is, to be a prosecutor means to be a voice for some of the most vulnerable in our community. And as a career prosecutor, I stood before many juries talking about the need to protect and to give dignity to a child who was a victim of child sexual assault, a woman who had been raped, or someone who had been murdered. And that's why I chose to do that work. And the reality of that work included, coming from a certain perspective, sometimes standing in front of that jury and saying, I know you don't like the victim. I had a case involving a child molestation case where the young woman, by the time we got to court, had been so harmed in her life that she felt the need to be very protective of herself. And so she just had a bad attitude. And when she testified, her arms were crossed and she was chewing her gum and she had bright red lipstick and she had clothes that everyone probably thought were too tight. And I stood before that jury and I said, I know you probably don't like her. And you would probably like to think that your daughter will not turn out that way, and you certainly wouldn't want your daughter to play with her. But that's exactly what those predators knew when they took advantage of her. I've stood before different juries and said, listen, let's all be very clear. The penal code was not designed or written just to protect Snow White. And so in that case where I had a substance abusing prostitute who was raped, talked with the jury about the need to take seriously the fact that if any one member of our society is harmed, it is a harm not just against that individual, but all of us. And that's the work I did as a prosecutor, and I believe that's completely consistent with everything that my parents fought for when they were fighting for civil rights.
You have an amazing family background. Your mom came from India, your father from Jamaica. You had a multicultural, intercultural upbringing. Tell us about what you learned from the cultures of your parents.
Well, I mean, I've been blessed to have had a really wonderful childhood. It was it was a childhood full of love and encouragement and stimulation and exposure. My mother, who did come to the United States from India to get her graduate degree, she was a breast cancer specialist, she was an endocrinologist, met my father when they were active in the civil rights movement. My mother understood that as an Indian woman, she had given birth to these two daughters who were will be African-American women, and she raised us in the African-American community. And it was a community surrounded by people, be it our Indian relatives or the Jamaican relatives or our extended family, who all believed that children should be nurtured and supported. You know, it was only, frankly, Karen, and I remember you and I had this discussion, because you were one of the first people to interview me right after I won as district attorney. And that was back in 2004. And running for office is it's a very interesting experience on many levels. But the first reality check for me about what it means to run for office came with questions like that. Because when you run for office, all of a sudden you find that people want you to describe yourself. And often they want you to describe yourself in the boxes that they've predefined. So which box do you fit in the boxes that I have around who people are? And so it was a very weird kind of experience trying to have this conversation about culture and race, because you know, I'm perfectly comfortable with who I am, and I was raised to be completely comfortable with who I am, but it is a story that I guess doesn't fit into predefined boxes, and so it was a challenge to try and explain that. But it really is about being in an environment where, you know, we were raised to understand culture and appreciate family and honor our elders and protect our children. And I think that what we all know is the more that you're exposed to, the more you'll find that people are much more similar and have much more in common than they do those things that make us different. And that's probably what I learned most.
You've been compared to President Obama. You know this label, the female Obama. Why is that such a, still such a topic of fascination for people when somebody comes from a bicultural, biracial background? Why do we still struggle with that?
First of all, I mean, it's a great honor to be compared to the President of the United States.
Okay, I'll take that.
And I am humbled. But I'll say that the conversation of race is still, it is a very complex conversation. It's something that in interviews, for example, that I've often told an interviewer, I'm happy to have the conversation. If you want to sit down with me for about 6 good hours, then we can have that conversation. But it's not a conversation that we can have in 5 minutes, and I'm certainly not going to be able to give you a soundbite on it. Because when you talk about the president's experience, I mean, he had to write books about it for people to understand his experience. You know, so it's a complicated subject. It's a subject that, if you're thinking about the history of race in the United States, we'll go back to the days where, you know, the octoroon rule. Anyone who had 1/8 African blood was considered African American, which means they did not have equal rights to property, to vote, equal rights as human beings. So it's a complicated subject, and when you talk about people who have multicultural backgrounds, it becomes even more so.
Mm-hmm. How has it helped you in your law career?
You know, I'll go back to one question I got right after I was elected district attorney, not by you, but somebody else, and actually it was a question I was commonly asked, because when I was elected district attorney in San Francisco in 2004, I was elected as the first woman district attorney, so, of San Francisco. And so these reporters would come up to me and they'd have the microphone in my face and they'd say, so, how does it feel to be the first woman district attorney of San Francisco? And I'd look at them and I'd say, well, I don't really know what to tell you because I've always been a woman. But I'm sure a man could do the job just as well.
All right.
So I don't know what to tell you. I can tell you that, that as much as anything, the influences on my career have included being raised in a family and an extended family where children were considered very important. My second mother had a daycare center that turned into a nursery school, that turned into an elementary school, and there were always children. Everybody was concerned with children all the time. And so part of what has influenced the policy positions that I have taken over the years, and that could be back on track, it could be the focus that I had as district attorney on truancy. It has been a realization and a need to fight for the point that we should not marginalize children's issues as being small issues, or marginalize it in a way, well, women care about that because their moms or parents care about that, or people who care about cute, cuddly things care about children. No, the reality is that children's issues should not be marginalized maybe because they're small people, but they're small issues, but instead we should realize that the impact that you can have on the life of a child will have an incredibly profound impact on what we otherwise consider big issues when it comes to what we see in our healthcare systems, our public health systems, our social services systems, and our criminal justice system. And so that's one of the influences that has definitely been something that came from the way I was raised that I continue to carry on.
I remember visiting your office in the Hall of Justice in San Francisco, which is this hulking, frightening building. And you were at the end of...
We call it Beirut West.
Beirut West.
Yeah.
It's fitting. It's just a concrete hulk. And you had turned your whole corridor into an art gallery with kids' art.
Yeah.
And you had put in a children's waiting room.
Yes.
And I asked you why. And I remember you talking about the fact that so often the kids are just the collateral damage and so much of the drama that goes on in a courthouse.
That's exactly right. And you know, so moms would come in connection with a domestic violence case, or just come in connection with a case and there was no other caretaker for the children. And you know, for the children to walk around this place and that is really dingy, you know, it's a horribly wonderful building. And so we created a room where they could go and be safe, and it's called the Teddy Bear Room, and there are books there, and then we had teddy bears were donated, children's books were donated, so when the kids were hanging out there, when they left, they were free to take a book and take a toy with them. And again, you know, we have to always think about children. I mean, because the reality is they don't have a voice at all in so many systems. And whatever impacts a child will impact what in a very short time will become an adult for their life. You know, I wrote a book, it's called Smart on Crime. One of the chapters in the book, half of the book I talk about myths that I believe are prevalent in the criminal justice system and make for bad criminal justice policy. And one of the myths that I think is prevalent in society is this belief that children are resilient. Oh, they're fine, they'll grow out of it. Oh, look, if he's playing in the playground, he's playing in the sandbox, he's fine. No, what occurs in the life of a child, especially if it is a traumatic event, will forever be imprinted in the life of that person unless we intervene and take it seriously, and hopefully take it seriously during and around the time that occurs. And I'll give you an example of an initiative I started as DA on that point. So we have a large number of children who are growing up in a community where there's a high rate of violence, where they're hearing gunfire every night. We have another whole population of children that are growing up in a home where there's domestic violence. I don't care what the socioeconomic condition of that family. And we expect that child to go to school the next day and benefit from the education that is there. It's unrealistic, because a lot of those children, having been exposed on a consistent basis to trauma, are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that when they're in the classroom, they're probably acting out because they're experiencing some level of memory of what happens. There are studies that are well documented that the simple example about post-traumatic stress disorder is that, so you're walking across a very busy street and a Mack truck is barreling down the street. The normal response, something will be ejected hormonally, you will see it coming, you will jump back. Now, if every day you're walking across that street and at some point, unknown to you, that thing comes, you're going to overproduce to the exaggerated point that one day you're going to walk across the street and that Mack truck is rolling down the street and you'll see it and you'll just walk across the street, right? And so what we need to do on this point, and so what we started was a whole initiative in my office that partnered with a pediatrician who was running a clinic in one of the high violence communities, along with a pediatric psychiatrist actually out at Stanford at Lucille Packard. And they've started to do this wonderful collaboration, and they're publishing on this issue of post-traumatic stress disorder and what we can do to address it and deal with it in a proactive way among children. And so part of it is they are creating and writing curricula for teachers to just be able to identify it and then do what is necessary to refer the child to whatever might be helpful. I did a training for our teachers in San Francisco on it, and it was, you know, so I talked to the folks I know in the teachers union, and oh, you want to bring them in for X-day training? I thought, come on guys, you can do it. and so they said, okay. And we brought the teachers in for a training, and it was an extraordinary thing. There was an auditorium, and the pediatric psychiatrist, his name is Victor Carrion, was doing the training, and I was just watching the teachers. And it was an amazing thing to watch, because there they were watching it, their eyes were open, their mouths were open, they were hitting each other, see, talking about it, because they're seeing it every day. But one of the great things that you can do is help people to just put a label on what they're experiencing or seeing as a precursor to the next step of hopefully ending the thing that is the thing that should be ended. And so we did training about that. But in general, what I'd like to see us do more in terms of distribution of resources in the criminal justice system is recognize the very real need to treat trauma as a crime prevention tool and as a way of otherwise dealing with what, again, we're going to see in our social services systems, our criminal justice systems, our public health systems. There's also, by the way, a very direct connection that is underappreciated between mental health and physical health. And so when we talk about having a national debate born out of on health care, born out of the recognition that we're just, even if you are not a compassionate person, the fact that is we are, you know, even if you don't care about people, the reality is that we are dumping billions of dollars as a country in this healthcare system. So we've got to figure out a way to lighten the load on the expense of it to us. And when you look again at the public health model that tells us let's deal with prevention first, it's just the smartest way of dealing with it. Early intervention next, and then we can react later in the emergency room if we have to, although that's going to be too late and too expensive. Well, on the issue of prevention, the connection between mental health and physical health is very real. You will see that in terms of the untreated trauma and what will then manifest in the public health system. And so it is something that is not just about mental health, it is also about all the other systems that we care about that are very expensive.
You do have a systemic way of looking at your job as district attorney, now as attorney general, and let's take a moment and talk about Back on Track, because you have written about being smart on crime, and this notion that if you're a Democrat, you must be soft on crime. If you're a Republican, you must be tough on crime. You went through a crazy election campaign to be against a conservative Republican opponent to become Attorney General of California. Talk about Back on Track and what your idea was there. This is a prevention and reentry model that's been emulated around the state and now around the country.
So, smart on crime, the philosophy is born again, and I guess this is part of my methodology, generally speaking, which is let's try and identify the false choices and fight them. And so it's a false choice to suggest that you're either soft on crime or tough on crime when you're thinking about your position on criminal justice policy. It's a false choice. Instead, we should be asking, are we smart on crime? Which means simply this. Yes, let's react to crime after it occurs. Serious and violent crime, lock them up. But we must, if we're going to be smart on it, be equally invested on the prevention of crime in the first place, not just the reacting to crime. So Back on Track is an initiative that literally, and this is the beauty of, for any of you who are thinking about running for public office, but all of you in your positions of leadership, you know, just kind of know what you can do and don't be burdened by what has been done before. Think about what can be done and hopefully surround yourself with people who will encourage you to actually be creative and to engage in innovation, right? Which means thinking about how we can be more efficient and effective and then coming up with a plan for doing that. Understanding also with innovation that we're going to always take a risk. You know, Silicon Valley, all these people know it. The first time you roll out the new idea, there will be a glitch, so you're going to have to kind of hunker down and hopefully have the courage to withstand the criticism that comes with that. But, you know, reconvene and do it again. Back on track. So when in looking at my caseload as district attorney, I knew that 60% of the cases that we are dealing with involve drugs. I also see crime as being on a pyramid, and I know this as a career prosecutor. Top of the pyramid, the worst of the crimes. Homicide, rape, child molestation. But truly what, and it's on the top of the pyramid because it's the most serious in terms of the impact on the victim and society and everyone. But truly what is occupying most of the space and dollars in the criminal justice system is at the base of the pyramid, the lowest level crime. And the problem with our criminal justice policy is we have pretty much adopted a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's not working. And what I'd like to see us do, just as a first step, is when we are asked to think about criminal justice policy, let's ask a question. Are we talking about violent or nonviolent crime? Let's just first bifurcate the way we think of it, understanding that there are different pathologies at play, depending on whether it's nonviolent or violent crime. So based on that principle, and also based on something else that's very simple, I decided to create Back on Track, focused on the 18 through 24-year-old, first-time, low-level, nonviolent drug sales offender. Why the 18 through 24-year-old? Well, when I was at college at Howard University, we were 18 through 24, and we were called college kids. But when you're in the system and you're 18, you are considered an adult, period. Regardless of the fact that that is the very phase of life in which we have invested billions of dollars in this world, knowing that's the prime phase of life during which people are capable of being molded and shaped and directed to becoming productive adults. But also, don't forget what we also know about that age range. They can be really stupid. That's why we make them live in dormitories with a resident assistant, with a curfew, right?
Absolutely.
So, the 18 through 24-year-old first-time offender. I wanted to focus on that person and figure out what we could do, recognizing all that is true about them being in that phase of life, and realizing also that the first time that someone is arrested for low-level sales of narcotics, when found guilty, they will be convicted of a felony, which means they will be a felon for life.
Right.
Right? So, decided to basically pull together a public-private partnership, which I think we need to do more of. And I called up my friends at the Chamber of Commerce, called up my friends at the building trades, called up some of our faith-based leaders, some of our nonprofits, brought them all together, our educational, and we created this program, Back on Track, that was about bringing apprenticeship programs, about making sure they have to get their GED. A lot of the first-time offenders we found were young parents who had a natural desire to parent their children, but not necessarily the skills. So we brought on board training for that. And we dealt with the fact that, this is just about looking at any population through the prism in which we all exist, instead of looking at them through a plate glass window, right? So part of it was also realizing most of them have bad credit, which will be an obstacle for anyone being able to get their life together. So we brought in CPAs to work on their credit, and those CPAs then said, and also, buddy, this is called the 1040 EZ, because we're going to expect you to pay your taxes, because you're going to get a job. This initiative it's now been 7 years running, reduced the reoffense rate for that population from 54% to less than 10%. And what we did is we created very tough standards. On the other side, when I was creating it, some of the public defenders were saying to me, we're not going to send our clients, it's too tough. And I was just talking to the young women who are here today about it. I purposely made it tough, because I'm going to tell you something. Part of the beauty of human nature is that when you set the bar high and give people the opportunity to reach it, they will naturally jump for it. You set it low, people know when you don't expect much from them, and they will respond accordingly. So we set a high bar, and it's a tough program, knowing what they are capable of doing. And what we had in the population, by the way, because you may have your images of who was in it, it was these two bright young women who are here today. We had UC college students who were trying to make a little money to pay their tuition.
Oh, great.
I had a number of young men who were coming back from Afghanistan, trying to figure out how to pull it together and make some money. It was a population there was one young man who by himself was raising 6 children because he had, I think, like 2 or 3 of his own. His sister, who was drug addicted, had a couple of, had this, raising them on his own. And one of them was about to go to college. And he just was trying to make some quick money, right? And so it's a remarkable program, and it's an initiative that is successful only because of the participants. It has been replicated now in other states, and we are in the process through my office, the Office of Attorney General, of encouraging replication up and down the state of California. I mean, and then part of the beauty of the design, though, is that it's a public-private partnership. And on that point, I just want to stress, because I think that it would be just a right point to make with all the leaders who are here. The beauty of public-private partnerships, in my experience, having always been a public servant, is that when you go to approach people who, for example, who've been successful in the business community, they have not only been successful in business, and consider themselves leaders of business, but also consider themselves leaders of a community. And it has often been my experience that when you then go to outreach around these kinds of partnerships, that they are willing to step forward. It's also my experience, especially the younger women here, that when you are asking someone for help, and you must always, it's a sign of strength, not weakness, ask someone for help. And invariably, the kind of person who's in a position to help you is usually the kind of person that when you ask for help, they will say yes. But a little tip on that too. Don't then ask them to be creative in figuring out how they can help you. Have some idea of exactly what you want them to do to help you, and then that makes it easier, and they actually might be able to do it. And so that was a lot of just the method behind the creation of Back on Track.
Thank you for that. I know that our audience has tons of questions. We haven't gotten to the California mortgage settlement, the $18 billion you brought home from to California. I want to ask one last question before we turn it open, and that is for the people in this room, the talent, the dedication, the passion that these women feel for civic and public life. How do we get more women to run for office? As one who has been through the campaigns, you've been through the slings and arrows.
Yeah.
How do we get more women to run?
We need more women in public office. We just do. For so many reasons that are probably obvious to everyone who is here. And so how do we do it? It's a number of issues, and this is, again, it's about just dealing with the nature of it all. You know, there's that saying, don't hate the player, hate the game. Well, you know, when I will speak with women's professional organizations, and one of the things that I say is, you know, most of us don't like to think, we look down on and don't want to participate in gamesmanship. And so sometimes women will have a certain bravado about saying, I'm not going to play that game. But the reality of it is, until we change the world, there are going to be rules to every professional environment. And you need to make sure you learn what they are. And then it will be on you to determine where it fits into your code and do or not do it. But don't off the cuff say, I am not going to deal with and play into the politics of a work environment, because it exists. And that's just a reality. And so with that spirit, I will also say about law enforcement, and then, but in particular about running for public office, there are just some things that are just the ugly facts of it all. You've got to know how to raise money. You know, so I was raised by an incredible mother, incredible. So smart, so independent. And one of the things that she taught her two daughters, don't you ask anybody for money. Right? So then here you are running for office, and this voice and this thing you have been raised to believe is the antithesis of your independence as a woman is the critical factor and component to actually winning. And so you gotta deal with that. And so when I've trained, like there's this program called Emerge, which is a great program that's about training young women to run for office. And when I've trained there and been an advisor, I've said to the women, like, let's just deal with the elephant in the room on that piece, right? So you've got to realize that when you are asking someone for money, when you're running for office, you are not asking them to buy you a pair of shoes. Okay? So be clear about that. But you do have to figure out how to raise money. You know, the great thing about most women, almost everyone that I've met in public office, is that there was some issue, something that made them decide to run. It was not about title, it was not about power, it was literally there was an issue that they cared about and felt that that voice should be represented in the places where the decisions would be made that would impact that issue. So part of what I'd encourage us all to do is to think about our opinion on a subject and value it, and have the courage and the encouragement to voice it. Because I also find that often women will, you know, we know it, right? We've talked about it so many times. You know, we're not the ones in the classroom to necessarily raise our hand and be in the front row speaking our thoughts. But any thought that you have, if you're having it, probably someone else is. And if you're having it, probably someone else has had the experience that propels the thought. And speak it. And so we want to encourage women to exercise their voice, is that point. And in general. And then, by extension, use that voice in public office. And, you know, in terms of the steps to getting there, be active, again, with nonprofits that do the work that is the area of interest to you. Be active with professional associations that do the work that is of interest to you. Take on roles of leadership and take them on. And don't be afraid to think that if I have a reason to believe that I can be a leader, that is somehow you know, egotistical. If you believe you can lead and you want to lead, then go for it. And we're all here to encourage you to do that and to applaud you when you do it. But all of that is important.
Good. Well, speaking of exercising voices, I think there are probably some people here who'd like to exercise theirs. And Lauren's got the microphone. When you have a question, just raise your hand, and if you could please identify yourself. We have Karen, and we have over here and over here.
So thank you. That is so interesting to see you so up close and personal, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Every time I've seen you over the years, you are working tirelessly. You just listed the things that you work on. Up and down the state, the environment, the mortgage crisis, bringing back to the state. You're so earnest about what you do. My question is more of a personal one, about family, and your thoughts about family, because I think, you know, you leave nothing on the table, and maybe one of the trade-offs has been not having a family, an immediate family. So I wonder, what does that mean to you in your life, in your work, and how do you think about it?
Well, I have a great family and a very loving family, and I think family is really, really, really important. And family comes in many, you know, many versions. But we all, I mean, you all, is so important to have and to work on having in your life people who are there simply because they love you. People who are close to you, who stand up and applaud you whatever you do, as long as it is not destructive. And some of us have the good fortune and blessing of being born into a family that does that naturally. And others create that family. And they're both legitimate and important. The most important thing is to make sure, to think consciously about whether you have that in your life, and if you don't, figure out a way to create it. Because it is really important. It is important to have people in your life who are just rooting you on. It's important to have people in your life that you can call in the middle of the night to cry or to curse or to laugh at the thing you shouldn't be laughing at. But people who will just be in your life, who love you and will not judge you, and are not judging you, but also who are honest with you. And so that's going to be a combination of people that you meet in school, people you meet in your workplace, people you meet wherever you go to pray, or wherever you go to work out, or wherever you go to do the hobby that you have. But actively work on that, because to do the kind of work that we do, it takes a lot out of you. It takes a lot just in terms of physical energy. It takes a lot in terms of emotional energy, and it takes a lot in terms of endurance. That is not only about physical endurance, but just, you know, we all each only have so much to give. And so it is about surrounding yourself with people who will allow you to replenish and just lift you up. And that's important. That's really important. So none of us do anything that we do alone. And that's the reality of it. So I might be sitting here apparently alone being interviewed by Karen. There are about 500 people sitting in this chair with me right now.
The network.
and certainly about 10 really close people right now who are sitting in this chair with me. And I know that's true for many of us here, and if it's not, figure out a way, especially you young women. And it doesn't matter, young women of any age. Seek out people who will mentor you and will and know that that's a sign of strength. It's a sign of strength.
Good. I think you had a question over here, Lauren.
Attorney General, hi. My name is Elizabeth Ashford, and I'm with Governor Brown's office. My question, well, one, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And it's really an honor. Also, kind of a personal question in a sense. I know that we really discuss a lot women mentoring women and the positives of that, but in my career, I've found at times that some of the greatest and toughest obstacles have been other women who have, you know, out of competition or out of insecurity or out of any, or just out of stress or whatever it is, you know, have sort of, you know, put things in the way. And I'm just curious about your thoughts about that, like why you feel that that happens, how as women going through our careers, what you would recommend as sort of mechanism for dealing with that, just sort of your feelings on it.
So first I would say that mentors come in many shapes and forms and sizes. And so some of my greatest mentors have been men. And women. Most of them have been women, but some have been men. And the reality of it is that the point that I was making with my last comments, I think are the most important on the point you raised. Surround yourself with people who are invested in you and want to see you succeed and want to support you. And the people who, the way you talked about it, who throw obstacles in your way, you got to just walk away from that. And don't spend too much time with that, frankly, because the more you try and achieve, the more obstacles will occur, because that's just the nature of it. And you want to keep your eye on the ball, and remain as optimistic as you can. And again, that means that means just kind of like letting go those things that where people may be unpleasant or not supportive, because there are plenty of others who are. Okay. And when all else fails, just remember there's this little piece of advice I will give you, which I give myself. When all else fails, just be lovely. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just be lovely. Just say to yourself, I'm going to just be lovely.
Today, in this moment. We had one more question here, in the middle.
Hi, I'm Jean Holston. I'm from the Bread of Life Center in North Sacramento.
Thank you.
I am of the opinion that a lot of our big systems are struggling, if not dying out. And we have some huge, huge challenges that are requiring us to engage each other differently. In fact, they're almost begging for it, and yet what's happening is that our political systems and a lot of our leaders are failing miserably, have decided to not even be civil in discourse. And the little hope that I have at this is that part of the new thing that's being born now, maybe, is women in leadership who might approach this differently. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
So there's kind of a theme here, because part of what I wanted to also mention about the last question was especially in politics, which is what you're in, just keep remembering why you're in it. And I'm sure there's some issue or some reason, and just stay focused on that. And figure out how you can achieve that. Because at the end of your day, you're going to work so hard, you're going to work so long, and you want to know that you've had some impact. And so when we look at current systems and our role in that system, I think part of what we need to rededicate ourselves to is are we having impact? And I think about that on a couple of levels. One, I constantly say to my staff, just so we can all keep things in check, we are not going to end world hunger. Like I promise all of you in this room, I am not going to end world hunger. But there are a couple of things I'd like to do. And hopefully I will do them and do them well. And so the point there being the obvious point, that I have reluctantly come to embrace triage, which is that I cannot do everything. None of us can. We have limited resources. There's so much that needs to be done, so much that is important, but we have to start somewhere. And so let's focus on a few things, and you just choose what they are and acknowledge that all the rest are important. It's not that they're not important, which is why you didn't choose them. You just have to start somewhere. So there's the point of triage. But the other point in terms of these systems is I think part of the failure of the system is that we in government have not figured out how to encourage and embrace innovation at all. And so, and I'll just give you a simple example. Any elected that's up for re-election is never going to take a political hit for doing things the way they've always been done. Good for you, Bob, you're doing things the way they've always been done, right? Innovation, we were talking about that earlier, by definition, means you're bringing to bear some new approach, some new method, some new device, a phone, right? Well, no matter how well thought out and planned that thing will be, when you roll it out for the first time, there will be a glitch. But when you hold positions like mine, that glitch will be on the front page of the newspaper, right? And society in general has not yet accepted the idea that innovation in government might be a good thing in terms of how it looks and watching the sausage get made, right? And you know, back to my childhood, one of the words that was very often used in the household was the word hypothesis. But in politics, you run for office because you have the idea, the plan, capital T, capital P, right? Which you must then defend at every and any cost because it, after all, was the plan, right? Instead of the hypothesis. No need to defend that because it was a hypothesis. Right. Hopefully well thought out, right? And so part of what I think we've got to figure out a way to do is to infuse a desire for our government to engage in innovation. And innovation, by the way, the point of it all is not because we're bored with the old system. It's because we are in pursuit of efficiency and greater effectiveness. And we're just not encouraging enough of that. I mean, I'm having experiences now that are just incredibly frustrating because there are people who just culturally are used to being in a position of defending what they have done. And part of innovation would require us to critically examine what has been done and recognize and agree that there's a better way to do it. But for some, that translates into past failure. So there's more, in terms of the culture of the system, more of a push to defend the old thing than do the new thing. And we've got to get around that. And certainly, you know, I feel that as Attorney General, with some of the work that we're doing, we have an opportunity to do that, and we've got to be willing to have the courage to say this thing is not working and this is a way to fix it. And by the way, what I'm proposing to fix as a solution is not the solution. It's one part of the solution. You know, this is the other reality of the problem with term limits and some other things. Any entrenched problem, by definition, is not amenable to a quick fix. By definition. It takes time. But our political system and government is set up in a way that there is a need for political survival to show results. And so part of the way that I think the methodology has to be is that we have to kind of set a portfolio for our agenda that includes some of the things we can do in the short term, some in the medium, some in the long. So we can kind of feed the need to show that we are doing something in the short, and plus there are things that are amenable to short-term fixes. And then, but you know, the agenda is going to also have to include doing that thing that may not actually manifest in your lifetime, but is something that can deal with an entrenched problem. I mean, the benefits of Back on Track are just now really starting to show. And you know, and that was part of the calculation we made, knowing that there would be some short-term fix, but in the long run, we'd show a systems change. So.
Thank you so much. We've come to the end of our hour, and we promised everybody, that's one of the golden rules of She Shares, is that everybody can go racing back to their,
yes,
to their crazy lives. But I want to ask you one last quick question, okay. and this is our She Shares tradition, but what piece of advice would you give your 17-year-old self?
That's fabulous. Oh, let's see. Probably I would probably have given myself the advice to learn another language.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. I think so.
Okay.
I'll think more about it. And get
There's
back
no
to
right
you.
or wrong. So thank you all so much for coming. I wanted to let you know that our next, our September speaker will be Nancy McFadden. Did Nancy join us today?
She's great.
She's working, she's running, anyway. Nancy is the Secretary for Legislation, Appointments, and Policy in Governor Brown's office, and understandably has legislation, appointments, and policy to deal with today. But she will be with us on Thursday, September 13th, so I hope you will all join us. Join us on Facebook at she_shares. Let us know what you like about the program, who you'd like to hear from, and we're always happy for your feedback. Thank you to the Attorney General of California,
welcome.
Kamala
Thank you
Harris.
all.
Thank you all.